All right, good morning. We're going to start in Module 16 for disinfection. Going to go through this and talk about why do we need to disinfect the water? What's the purpose of it? How do we accomplish it? What's the benefits? What's the pitfalls? What are some of the challenges? One of the main things that we look at when we look at disinfection is our microbial contaminants in the water. And especially, again, coming off of surface water, there can be some real issues. If you have cross connections, we've already mentioned a little bit about cross connections. That's a real big source of contaminants in our system. If we're not aware of those, we don't have the proper training and certifications, understand our system well. And then we're going to look at some of the alternative disinfectants. I know here we've talked about there's not a lot of things going on with like chlorine dioxide or people using chloramines. State of Texas, if you're running a surface water treatment plant, you're going to run chloramines, and that's just a requirement. So everybody's doing that. Arizona's using a lot of ozone. Real expensive process, and you can't use it for final disinfection, but they're using it as part of their pre-treatment program to help with their disinfection byproducts. Real expensive, a lot of technical expertise required for it, but that's what they're using to incorporate into some of the real big systems out in Arizona. So it's interesting to see who's doing what. Some of it's based on regional water quality issues. Some of it's based on history. What do people normally use? What do they not like to use? So that's just an interesting dynamic when you start looking at various states. Waterborne diseases. Why are we wanting to disinfect our water? Got to get rid of the pathogens in there. Again, you can have pristine water coming off your lake, something like that. You're still going to have potential contaminants with waterborne. And when surface water treatment actually looks a lot at how much crypto do you actually have in there. That's going to be your bin classification. So what's your source water look like? That's a real important component of it. If you're getting it wholesale, then somebody else is having to deal with that front end of it. You just have to make sure that what they're sending you is appropriate. You're still having to pull your back tees and things like that. So you got to make sure that your system is, the integrity of your system is intact, but somebody else has to deal with all the treatment components of it. Are we trying to sterilize it? No, that's not practical. Costs too much. It's not necessary. There are beneficial microbials. We have them in our system every day. And if that balance gets upset, we know about it because we're going to spend a lot of time in the bathroom. You get the wrong pathogens in you, you're going to spend a lot of time in the bathroom, possibly in the hospital. So we're not trying to necessarily sterilize because that's just overkill on the treatment. But we do need to have the ability to get rid of the pathogens or the parasites that are going to cause a lot of problems to our general population. So, and then we also need to look at our compromised or vulnerable populations, our subpopulations, children, the elderly, people that are really sick. They have a lot of, they're more susceptible to the levels. We can have certain amounts of pathogens go in us and it really not affect us, but some populations, a very small amount can make them really sick, and that's what happened in Milwaukee. The majority of the people that passed away were either the elderly or the immunocompromised. So those are things that we have to be considerate of when we're looking at our disinfection techniques and what water we're actually sending out. Different types of diseases. Luckily, we don't see a lot of these anymore. One of the big ones that happened recently, a few years back, was Haiti. They had the big earthquake down there, and it wasn't necessarily, you had fatalities from buildings collapsing and stuff, but the biggest rate of or cause of the fatalities that they incurred was through cholera. They had the compromise of their systems. They didn't have great systems to begin with. What little they did have, you don't have any way to treat your waste, and that's a huge issue. And in fact, out of the top 10 things that have increased the life expectancy of humans has been water and wastewater treatment. If you think about 100 years ago in New York, what do they have running up and down the streets? You have horses defecating all over the place. Here comes the rain. It's washing it right into the watershed. People are trying to consume that water. They have a lot of issues. So when they started using chlorine as a disinfectant, that was a major change. And then when they started doing the wastewater treatment, Those have really, so as an industry, and I'm proud to be a part of it, we're public health professionals. In many, many ways, we're responsible for the water that we're sending out to the people, and life expectancy has basically doubled in the last 100 years for humans. So, and we have a significant, us and our predecessors have a significant contribution to that goal. So, what are we looking at? Are we going to try to detect all organisms? No, too expensive, too costly, takes too long to do some of the tests. Some of them aren't easily detectable. So we're going to look at the ones that are easily detectable, right? So we're going to look for our fecal contaminants, things that are coming off of our feedlots, out of our pastures, things like that. Even cross-contamination or from septic systems. If you have a septic system in close proximity to your well and you don't have good wellhead protection, now you've got a real potential source of contamination into your wells. So we're going to look at our total coliform groups as our indicator organisms. And then we're going to drill down even more specifically. We're going to look at our E. coli. So we're doing total coliform and fecal coliform on our presence-absence tests. Total coliform says you got a problem. E. coli says you really better pay attention. You really have something going on in your system there. And of course, it's coming from your warm-blooded animals, your mammals. The biggest indicator or biggest issue is acute sickness. Some of the things with disinfection byproducts, we're looking at chronic illness, being exposed to this over long term, and winding up with cancers and stuff like that. The thing about pathogens, waterborne pathogens, you're going to know it pretty quick. You're going to know within 24 to 48 hours if you've been exposed, because you're going to have a lot of people. And that's what happened in Milwaukee. Started to get people coming into the hospital. Now you just got a flood of people. And imagine 100,000 plus people showing up at hospitals and all, and doctors' offices. Now they got to try to figure out what's going on, where it's coming from, what is it, and then you got to work backwards. So public health is a very interesting dynamic when you start looking at outbreaks, big outbreaks. When we're looking at sampling, who's doing sampling in here? Do y'all sample your own? Y'all do any training for sampling? Are you sampling yours? Have you had any training on it?
Yeah.
Who did training for you? Was it? Okay, good. That water sampling courses are really important. They can do water and wastewater. Normally just an 8-hour class or something like that. Do y'all offer anything through the state? Okay, yeah, that's a real important. Because if you don't have somebody that's properly trained, ultimately, if it's your utility or you're part of the utility, it's on you if you pull bad samples. That's a big issue. But you want to get a good representation of what's going on in the system. So we really need to know how to collect our samples. We'll talk a little bit about that. And then how do we know how many samples we're going to do? Is it number of taps? Population, right? It's based on our population. How many samples are y'all pulling a month? How many? 3 samples a month? Okay. Anybody have any big numbers? Everybody's pretty small? Okay. City of San Antonio pulls over 300 a month, so they've got a really big map where they're pulling from all over the place. We're going to talk about our site sampling plans and the importance of it, and then how do we get a good plan in place. One of the things that we really need to consider, how do we represent our system well? So we want to designate areas, but we want to have alternate points also. And not only do we want to designate an address, but have something where it's more specific, where you say, I'm pulling it from this hose bib. Make it very descriptive. So when you go to if you have to pull repeats, you have somebody going out there that's not familiar with the area, they can make sure that they're pulling it from the same location. So your site sampling plan is really important. One of the things that we talked about is using some of the wording like in the vicinity of. So you designate a place, but yet you have that flexibility of maybe upstream or downstream a little bit if there's construction going on at the house. If somebody's out there replacing a line, it's vacant home for a while, that's not a good place to pull from. So that's really what we want to look at when we look at our site sampling plans. Knowing your distribution system. How many have maps of your distribution system? Using any GPS? Huh? Anybody using GPS to designate your main locations, your valve locations, hydrant locations?
A lot of them getting more and more into
That's, it's not expensive to get a handheld GPS device and be able to go out and identify where your valves are and stuff. Put it on a little spreadsheet, so that if you do have an issue, you can go back and look at your different pressure zones and stuff. So,
It's a larger system than municipalities, that is
yeah,
GIS departments.
yeah,
So,
yeah. There's some really neat interactive maps that you can use. Actually pull it up and look at when the valve was made, what the size of the valve, the manufacturer of the valve. I mean, if you got the money, there's somebody out there willing to build you a system. But yeah, especially on the large ones, they've got some really neat stuff out there. But even as a small system, even if you just have a few taps and all, still having a good understanding of what your main size is, where your laterals are located, it's not that expensive to be able to utilize some of that technology and incorporate it. And it's going to make it easier for you if you have an issue to go out there and know go find what you need.
that's one of the things, a lot of these guys, I mean, some of these guys are pretty close to retirement, and when we've heard stories, one of their systems had to hire someone who had retired to come in and tell them what their valve was so that they could fix a leak downtown.
Yep.
So getting locations on everything
Yeah.
is just gonna help out.
Yep. That's real. Mentoring is a huge issue in our industry right now, and day-to-day operations takes away so much of your time, and it's understandable. I mean, that's the nature of the business. You got to put out the biggest fire and then go to the next biggest fire and down the road. But mentoring, because again, when you look at the knowledge that you have, and when it walks out the door, unless you can get them back, it's gone. And that's a real important. Yesterday, a gentleman was talking about, he was out, and he had 19 years in the distribution system, but he was pretty new, maybe first couple of years, couldn't find a valve to isolate something, calls up a guy that had retired, and he says, well, go over to the sidewalk, and you're going to see an X chipped into the concrete sidewalk with a pickaxe. He says, there's a valve under there, So that's that's just an interesting dynamic when you start looking at the age of the population. We had a big problem with our wastewater treatment facility. We had a number of the Tech 4s, the highest levels. They were getting ready to start retiring, and they're bringing in trainees. And if you do that a little bit, it's not a big deal. But they had several, 6, 8, 10 of their top people retire, and then they start wondering why they're having a lot of problems with the plant. Well, you don't have any experience in that plant. You might know about wastewater, you might have a license, but if you don't know that plant, you don't know that distribution system, that's tough. We started talking about in the distribution system about valving and all. Start having water quality issues. Oh yeah, well those guys were out there working on that. I bet they didn't open that valve back up, or how to valve to help out a dead end area, low population area, put in a big main, expecting all this, new growth out there, and it doesn't come for years. You gotta figure out how to move that water around that system, so you're not just dumping it on the ground. So that's a lot of things to consider. Looking at 5 samples or less, so you're pulling 3, so you got 3 different sites you're pulling from. How many taps do y'all have? Okay, so you can really spread it out nice and see where you want to do it. Good. Talked about making the address, be as descriptive as possible, give yourself some flexibility in the language of it, just like we talked about a minute ago with your sampling. If you're going to go by AWA standards, well, then you're going to test a lot more than what the state requires. So figure out what your language is, and these guys are good resources to do that. Then you got to be able to provide the right information for them. We don't have any. You're non-community, or are you considered transient, or you're non-community? Yes, sir.
It's transient. No one lives there.
Okay. And you said it's a marina and all?
Marina and campground.
Okay. Okay. So if you're part of the NTNC, anybody in here, NTNC, non-transient, non-community, like schools and stuff? What are y'all considered? Are you considered transient? What are you considered? Are you, because you have homes out there also? Okay, have enough taps and stuff? Okay, good. Excuse me. So if you are non-transient, then you do need to make sure that you select someplace in your business, an appropriate place Don't do the sink area where the mop sink where everybody's, think about your process. One of the big issues that they were having in some of the locations is the blending valves. On a lot of the kitchen sinks are going to a blending valve now instead of two independent valves. So if you don't really isolate it well and just pull off the cold water side, you're possibly pulling out of the hot water side. That can be an issue for you for your back tea. So it's just thinking about your sampling techniques. Where's the good place to pull it? We'll get into some disinfection and all of them a little bit later. And then we talk about the recreational areas. So are you still have to pull back teas and all for your area? Okay. How many do you pull a month?
It's not every month, it's
Yeah,
like,
they're on quarterly.
Oh, are you? Okay. All right. Are you pulling the samples yourself, or do you have somebody else come out? Who's running the samples for you?
I send them to this Knoxville.
Okay. Okay. All right. And you shipping them overnight or?
Kind of expensive.
Huh?
Kind of expensive.
It is, and that's one of the things about trying to figure out where you can save, and sometimes that's if there's not anybody close to you that is willing to run your samples for you.
Yes, they do.
They do have it now?
Yes.
Andy did.
There's one where Mount City just got certified. They're like, we got certified. I'm not sure what it is.
I've been in the pension round to some of your places. that-
You have to check it.
Yeah. What's he?
Don't have anything to do with it. Take it down and get it.
At the home water?
No, it's the Mount Stevens water treatment that lives
Out of Silver
at
Lake.
Silver Lake.
Oh,
You need to talk to Andy Vaughn, I'll give you.
Networking. That's an awesome opportunity to look at alternatives. Yeah.
It's about as close as the post office, so.
Yeah. Well, and then you got to figure out what's it costing the shipping and the analysis. So that's just part of your business.
Black hole and Melly
Yeah.
territory, but our lab, we get a lot of over 30-hour samples. When our lab goes to pick up the sample at the post office.
Yep.
How much do you charge? For this test? I can't remember, $25?
I think it's 13 now.
16 shipping and.
Yeah, if you get 24 hour guarantee.
And how often are you doing it? Every month? How many do you pull? One sample a month? Yep. And that's a cost that we have to incur. I mean, it's part of our requirements for our sampling. They're talking about they're pulling one a month that it costs them $50 a month to get. Is there somebody close, or do you have to send it off? Okay, so you have at least somebody you can deliver it. But, and you start figuring out how many people need how many samples. That adds up. So, and then how do you defray those costs? So. Anyway, so start a business, get certified by the state, start running samples, and get you a mobile lab or something. So we do need to have a distribution map. We do need to designate on there where we're going to pull our samples from, even if it's a real simple map. That's still important to have that available. And then there's some information and table about how to list the sites and so on. It's the same thing as you would for a community system. Back tea samples. Where do you get your bottles from? Y'all ordering them? Okay, so you get it from the lab. So they're including that cost in the $50.
I know it's kind of open.
Everything just automatically sends bottles.
Good. So that's helpful, because a lot of the small systems, they don't have the opportunity to order, to make it worth their while to order a big batch of them. So we need to get our bottles. We need a sample from our designated sites. How long are y'all flushing before you sample? What's the rule of thumb?
You're on the spigot or wherever?
Yes, sir. Yeah, whatever your sample tap
I
is.
just let it run.
So how do you know when it's time to take your sample? Do you have anything to test your chlorine residual?
Yeah.
What do you have? You using a pocket colorimeter, or you use a?
Color tester.
Okay. You put it in an instrument and give you a digital number, or you do it in a color wheel, or?
Two, like
Oh, okay. So you're using a system that's similar to like a pool kit. Okay. What do y'all have for y'all's, Jason? Okay, all right. So you're using a DPD method because you really should be using a EPA approved method, and DPD is an approved method. We talked yesterday about that. There's now a strip method that's supposed to be approved by EPA, which I didn't know about. I'm an instrument guy, and of course, when you come out of a big system, everybody's got a pocket colorimeter.
I got an app on my phone.
There you go. Hey, you almost could stick your phone in there and figure out. Heck, you could probably get pH, alkalinity, all that. Yeah. So you want to look at your methods. A lot of times, especially the older gentlemen in our distribution system, they had the color wheels, and they wouldn't let them go. They'd hide them so people couldn't find them. Because if supervisors found them, they're supposed to take them away, so they'd go to the electronic colorimeter. But if you do use the color wheel, make sure it's not old and faded. It's not sitting out in the sun, because it'll change it. It is. There is some discretion in there when you look at it and stuff, so you kind of get a ballpark. But I'm a big fan of having instrumentation, knowing that it's calibrated properly, and then getting good results and have confidence in that data. You know, coming out of a lab, you got to prove that the number you have is a valid number. And how do you do that? It's your quality assurance and your quality control program. So, and it's not that difficult with pocket colorimeters and all to have secondary standards and be able to calibrate your instrument fairly regularly. And always follow the manufacturer's recommendations on how often you might need to send it back or when it needs to be replaced. Some will have a certain service life, things like that. So 5 minutes is a good rule of thumb on your flushing. If it's an area that's not being used a lot, you want to make sure that you get it flushed well. You want a temperature change. You know you're pulling out of your main and not out of your lateral when you get a temperature change. And a good chlorine residual. You know, and that's one of the requirements, is doing a chlorine residual whenever you're getting ready to pull your back tees. What are y'all using? Your DPD? Yeah. I like Hawk. Hawk makes excellent products. I'm not a Hawk salesman, but I just tell you what works well. Hawk works real well. So we do need to test our chlorine. Anybody flaming anymore? Is everybody disinfecting your taps before you sample? Yeah, with a small bleach solution. Okay. Talked to you the other day about using Lysol. They asked me what I thought. My personal opinion is I would stay very far away from Lysol as a disinfectant. So there's just a potential of other residuals and stuff being on there. I'm a big chlorine guy, so I like it as a gas. If I can't have it as a gas, then liquid is fine, stuff like that. But I know a lot of people aren't using chlorine, especially in the small systems. But I love the fact that I can hit it with chlorine, and I know that I know that I've taken care of it as long as I meet my concentration and my contact time. If I've got my CT squared away, then other than the Giardia and crypto, I've taken care of it really well. So we need to make sure we disinfect it properly, flush it real well. When we get ready to pull our sample, how many times do we rinse it out? 0? Okay. Sometimes I hear 3. Sometimes I hear twice, which is always interesting. 0.
Except the crystals in the bottom just kill the chlorine.
Yeah, it dechlorinates. Yes, sir. You're correct. It does. It actually binds with the chlorine. It makes it where it's no longer active. So yeah, there's different types of preservatives, right? When you're pulling lead and copper, you need to have a acid in there to put it in to lower the pH so it stays in solution. So there's different preservatives that you're going to have in your bottles. You don't want to rinse that out. And especially sodium thiosulfate is a very important dechlorinator, so we don't want to rinse it out. But it's interesting some of the responses you get. Say, because in the lab, normally when you're pulling samples and you're getting ready to run them, rinsing 3 times is real proper, except when you have a sample bottle that is preserved. Okay, and what's one of our most common preservatives? Temperature, right? Temperatures are one of our most common preservatives that we use on a real regular basis. And why 4 degrees centigrade? right, which is what the temperature that we're supposed to meet, that's where water's at its densest, okay? The molecules are most close together. Once it goes lower than that, they start to actually spread apart as they form ice. That's why ice floats. We're really fortunate that ice floats. Otherwise, the lakes would freeze from the bottom up and everything would be dead. So some of the dynamic properties of water, really, really neat. And but that's why we want to preserve our sample properly, right? Chain of custody is real important. If you're pulling your own samples, need to document where you're getting it from, when you're getting it, all the different, your residual things like that are important to have as a part of your sampling. Questions, comments? Need to have it there within 30 hours, so 6-hour hold time and 24-hour shipping, and then obviously needs to be sterile with your sodium. Some people add it. It's easy enough to buy it with the tablets. And do we know how much those tablets will neutralize of our chlorine residual? Any ideas? How many milligrams per liter? About 15. Okay, so you can have a pretty hot sample and still be able to dechlorinate it properly. Okay, about 15 milligrams per liter, which is pretty hot. Normally, hopefully you're not going to find that in the distribution system, but if you do a new construction or things like that, and you still have a kind of hot sample, you can have good confidence that you're pulling a good sample.
Now, when we set the samples and we don't ice them,
Y'all not shipping them under ice? Okay, highly recommended. What?
shipping would go up.
Huh?
Shipping would go up.
Our standard sample container is a little cardboard tube, the lid.
Well, and then that's that's some of the dynamics of each area. That you're working with your regulatory. If they're okay with it, the thing is you have a higher probability of a positive by not refrigerating it properly. Pardon? Sure. And you can get, if you set it up with a lab, a lot of times they have a lot of those, because they get them in things that they order, they'll have some of those little freezer packs. And so you can set it up to where,
Well, yeah, maybe you could do it, I figured it out, but shipping's gonna go up, but now if I can agree with Mount City, that's still not cool.
Yeah.
The standard, the laboratory manual says if it's going to be more than 2 hours, that you should ice it.
And then, nitrates.
That's what our lab would send out, and that's what we send out.
yeah. And when a lot of times when we talk about this, we talk about best management practices. What's the optimum thing to do to ensure the best results? And that is, after you pull your sample, you need to put it on ice. Even if you're delivering it to your lab, half an hour away, something like that. Best management practices is to start in the preservation process, and that benefits you as a utility operator or owner, because you're minimizing the chance of what we consider to be a false positive. Right now, if you have one in there, one microorganism, your presence absence test should test for it. But then if you have to go and start plating it out afterward to determine what you actually have, you're increasing that because it's still, you're in a growth phase. So now the thing is, what I talked about earlier is, do you have your cooler? Hopefully you don't have your adult beverages or whatever else in there with it, and you're throwing your sample bottles in there. How do you protect the integrity of the sample? Well, Ziploc plastic bags would be a good thing to put it in before you set it into the cooler. If you're using the little plastic freeze containers or something like that. Obviously water and ice as a bath is the very best technique, but that's not always practical. So you have ice in there, and you can shove it down in the ice. That's excellent technique. Okay. Now, if you're going to deliver it somewhere, I personally would highly recommend that you preserve it in that fashion with temperature. Okay. 100 mils, plus or minus about 5%. So normally there should be a mark on the shoulder of the bottle. If you overfill it, get rid of it, start over. It's just a lost bottle. So don't try to decant a little off, pour a little off or something like that. Just be real careful when we're pulling it. What size stream do we want? Pencil stream? right? We want a real small stream, don't want a lot of splashing. We need to understand about what days are good days and what days are not good days to pull it on. Windy days, especially if you're out in an agricultural area, windy days, you're going to potentially contaminate that sample. There's always the potential of airborne contaminants. Think about your sampling day, rain events and all. Those can be contributing factors to a positive. And it could be a false positive. It could be, we can have a false negative because I can have bacteria in there, pathogens, and I can dump a bunch of bleach and I get a negative, but I really had stuff in there, so I can have a false negative. I can also have a false positive. I can contaminate that sample from my cooler, from my hands, from the atmosphere, but it's not really in my water, so that's a false positive. So what we want is, if it's really negative, we want a negative. If it's really positive, we want a positive. And that's how we want to handle it. I had a question Tuesday about wearing gloves, especially if you're pulling systems that pull a number of samples, and about wearing the rubber gloves, lab gloves and stuff. I recommend not doing that because people become complacent. They have their gloves on. Next thing you know, they're doing all kinds of stuff, and now they're over handling the samples. Wash your hands well, whatever you need to do to prepare for your sample taking. Take it serious. I take it real serious, pulling a sample. And it benefits you as an owner or operator of the system to pull the best sample you can. So when you're working in micro in the lab, you just don't wear gloves.
See, the people in the field, if you have a positive sample, you blame it on the lab people blame it on the field.
Yes, sir.
It can happen in the lab also.
It can. If they don't have good integrity in their lab, their quality assurance program, QA/QC. I agree. Yes, and I've been in both, so I understand it's always pointing fingers. We had a big issue with our distribution system. With after they do repairs, it's all about how fast can you get to the next job. It's all about numbers. It's all about, and so we're trying to work on a good program where they're pulling samples and submitting them to the lab. Well, I'd have them come in with a Coke bottle that they had rinsed out a couple times and pulled a back tea in, and it's been sitting on their dash for 3 days, and I'm like, not going to be a good sample. Sorry, And also with a chlorine residual, it's a 15-minute test, but here they are bringing it in, 2 or 3 days later, wanting to know what the residual is. Well, what does it matter? It's been gone a long time. First of all, you don't have any in there because it's degraded. It's been sitting on the dashboard, and it's UV's degraded it already. You probably had some demand in there from the Coke bottle if you didn't rinse it well.
Sounds like you need some Tennessee.
It's interesting. There's you have some really high caliber individuals in any organization, and then you got individuals that it's like, how did you get this job? But. And why are they letting you keep it? but I agree. So we don't want to overfill it, and then we need to say the type of sample. I know we had a conversation about now if you're actually doing repairs on your mains or something and it's back in service, now it's part of your monthly sampling and part of your MCL for your month instead of a special sample. So you can have construction that's not in service, or you just have your normal distribution samples, correct? So that's an important component of it now. Who's pulling samples after? I know we had a conversation yesterday about, we'll get into distribution, but depending on how you're doing your repair, depends on what you have to do, if you have to do a slug method or if you have to swab it or.
It really depends on what you have, whether or not you have some kind of introduced contamination, like a failing septic system leaking into the trench.
Yeah.
Like that, or the pipe, there's some reason that you just, the pipe gets contaminated during installation, things like that. Things to look at.
Okay. What do we do if we have a positive? How many do we have to pull? What's the rule of thumb? Well, if you only have one a month, you have to pull 5, right? Okay. So you're pulling 3, but then also if you're on groundwater, you're pulling from your source, or you're requiring them to pull.
They have to do 5 the next month. If the sample systems who take 1 have to take 4 repeats.
Okay.
If they have a positive, systems who take 1 and 5 can take 3 repeats.
Yeah. Source. I mean
Systems who
the
take less than 5 a month, if they have a positive, the month following, they have to take 5.
Okay. What about source? Are they going to the source and pulling a well?
If it's a groundwater system, they have, we just tell them to call us,
Yeah.
They have positive.
Yeah.
We'll walk through the groundwater rule.
Good, good.
That way, if you get positive, we'll tell you what kind of samples you have to take.
Yeah, if you just have one well, it's not bad. You know where to go. But if you have multiple wells, and then you got to go figure out what wells was running at the time the positive came in, or that had been filling that tank or things like that. So, especially on big systems, you have more work to do when you're going to go figure out what your source water potential contamination is. But when in doubt, give a call. So, one upstream, one downstream, need to be collected on the same day within 24 hours of notification, correct? If you only have one sample point, then you can do either 4 consecutive days or 4 times throughout that day, and preferably a couple hours apart. Give a little bit of time. Virgin Islands, if they have a positive, they go out and they pull 400 mils from one point, and then they split it up. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to split it like that, but that's what they do. So, because again, every system is so small, a lot of times they don't have a lot of different sample points. So, invalidating, you can get it removed if it comes back as a negative, and you can have a logical reason in coordination with the state of what the potential error was, that it wasn't a valid representation of your sample site. So, paperwork, like always, something you have to do. You got to coordinate with the state. We had an issue where out at our Kelly Air Force Base had been turned over to the city and had its own little water system. And in their infinite wisdom, the management was going to have people that were doing industrial waste samples also, since they're out running all over the place, they're going to go pull their potable water samples also. Yeah. See, eyebrows raising. They're thinking about it from a dollar sign, and they're not thinking about it from a sample integrity side. So I had an individual go out that wasn't familiar pulling water samples, pulled about 15 or so out of that little system that day, had like 10 positives. And I was in the lab, start pulling them up, and everything's yellow. It's like, man, we got major issues. So we got to coordinate with the state. We got to go back and do a lot of additional sampling and stuff like that to get it squared away. So it is possible to get them invalidated. It's better if you pull good samples, and then you don't have to worry about it, you know. So, words to the wise. Like always, if you have questions, you have good resources available. Okay, it's still going to be included in your MCL, but at least you'll have it off of your, for your CCR and things like that. Monitoring requirements. You are in violation if you're not pulling your regular samples or you're not pulling your repeats like you're supposed to. For your MCL, for your total coliforms, nobody in here is pulling more than 40 samples, but if so, it's a 5% rule. If you're pulling less than 40 samples, you get a positive, you got a violation. So you got repeats to do and all that other kind of fun stuff. And then we start looking at our acute risks, which are things like our fecal contamination or positive repeats and stuff like that we'll have to get into our public notification. TCEQ is our state regulatory agency. Just like any state, contact the regulation. If you have an acute violation, boil order notices, things like that, 24 hours. You got to get with them, and I know y'all provide a lot of oversight in what you're going to say. Don't start sending out paperwork before you contact the state.
We have the time and it's available, we'll just write it for them while they're taking care of what they have to take care of.
That's very, very helpful. Very helpful. If it's a non-acute, it used to be 14, now it's 30 days that you need to send out non-acute violations, public notification, and then the other is every year. You got a year to send out certain requirements, and then you can just put it in your CCR. That should be going. Is everybody doing consumer confidence reports? Okay. No, because you're on a transient system. Okay. You have a template that the state provides that you're able to use. Okay. That's real helpful. A lot of them, they have a little cut and paste and put your information in and put in your lab values. And that's very helpful. EPA is going through committee, and I think it's been approved, but it's not been finalized, about instead of having to do mailings, they're going to look at being able to put it on a website.
We're recommending well, we're recommending this year to continue to mail them.
Yeah.
Or do whatever, because there's too much still up in the air on it.
Yeah.
I hate somebody get nailed for something that nobody
Yeah.
knew was gonna be wrong.
Yep. Yeah, there's an article in fact, I was looking on the plane, the AWWA, OpsFlow has an article in there about a small little article, but it's a good thing. They're slowly moving into that where you can send it out as emails, you can send it out as put it on a website, dedicated URL website and stuff like that. But until it's finalized and the state is ready to move into that area, you need to go ahead with the regular bulk mailings or however you're notifying, whatever's appropriate for your community. But slowly but surely they're moving into the 20th century. We're not in the 21st yet, but we're almost in the 20th century on some of our technologies. When do we have to be careful, or when we got to pay attention with our sampling and all? If we have low flow issues, what do y'all require? You have to have less than 20 for a certain period of time. And then
Roughly 20 PSI.
then you got to pull samples. Okay. If you have unacceptable repeats, positives, if you're not maintaining your residuals properly, and then you're going to have to talk with them and find out what it is that they want you to do. You're going to have to do boil order notices, flushing. What do you have to do to get that system back into compliance? Chlorination. Is everybody using sodium hypochlorite? Bleach? You don't even have any disinfection, right? It's just what comes in. What do you use if you're doing out there and you doing distribution repairs? Okay. You don't use any of the powder? Okay, so you're just spraying it or swabbing it? Okay. What about y'all? What are you using for your system?
Chlorine.
Okay, so you're using
I did a 10,000 gallon storage tank that has chlorinated floating in it. It was perfect.
okay, so you're using tablets then?
Yeah.
Okay.
The pool.
Okay. Are you getting the ones that's for a swimming pool, or are you getting ones that's for drinking?
They checked it and it's.
Okay, good. Okay, a lot of people go down to the local pool supply and they want to buy, calcium hypochlorite, which is your powder, and it can be in a tablet form. But for the swimming pools, they're going to have a lot of other things in there that you don't want in your water, biocides and algalicides and things like that. So we're talking about NSF approved. As long as it's NSF approved, then it's safe to be in your drinking water. And that's real important. So are y'all even chlorinating? So you're just getting it and sending it? Well, that makes it easy for your system. And then you just have your distribution. If you have a problem out there, you have a way to disinfect. Okay. Yeah, a lot of them are slowly going to on-site generation is a neat process when we start talking about some of the different disinfection techniques. One of the things that we need to have a residual. We don't want a demand. There's still going to be some demand in our system from some microbial, the non-pathogenic. And water age. There's other components that'll slowly degrade at temperature, things like that. But we want to make sure that we have a residual in our system. What are y'all getting in from your source water? How much are they sending you residual? 1.5.
About 1.5, 1.7.
Okay, so that's pretty. And what do you get on the end of your system?
About 1.2 to 1.
So you're having real little degradation. That's good. Okay, and that's something to really think about when you're looking at your system. Is what do you have at the end? Because if you're right down around the 0.2, and you're coming in pretty at a decent, you've got something going on in your system, and because you have demand in there. So what's happening from point A to point B? So one of the good things about chlorine, and y'all aren't having to really deal with it, is taste and odor. If you're on a groundwater, you really normally don't have taste and odor issues. If you're getting it wholesale, you're not having it either. But if you're pulling surface water, that's a good way to get rid of it. Problem with that is if you're chlorinating at the head of your process, then you can potentially be building disinfection byproducts. So you can wind up with a different problem. You're taking care of one problem and you're creating another one. So that's why people are going to some of the others like chlorine dioxide or ozone, depending on your source water, in your pretreatment portion to make sure that you're not building disinfection byproducts. Get rid of all that organics and stuff that you have. Iron, manganese, especially some of the groundwaters can have high hydrogen sulfide, so that's a good way to get rid of it also. And then if you're doing repairs, you got to be able to disinfect. Disinfect and then flush well. And we're looking at our hypochlorites. We have two types: sodium, which is our bleach solution, and typically about 6 to 12%. And then calcium hypochlorite is our powders or our tablets that we're using, about 65%. So the way I remember it, sodium chloride, it's salt on your table at your house, and bleach normally you have in your house too. So sodium and then calcium hypochlorite. Pure chlorine, they're actually using a brine, putting a electrical impulse through it, and then it's separating out into chlorine gas and hydrogen gas. And one of the issues that they're having with the on-site generation, which is a really neat process, but if you don't have it temperature controlled, if it gets too hot in there, now you're starting to produce pure chlorine and hydrogen gas, and it's explosive. We talked about that they had an explosion not too long ago, maybe I guess a year or so ago, over in Middle Tennessee, where they had a system, got too hot, they didn't have it properly ventilated, hydrogen gas and electrical source, and they had an explosion, and the operator lost his life. So great techniques, but you got to be careful of you got to know your dangers. You got to know how to run your systems properly. Now, if you're just using a bleach solution that you're either buying or you're bringing it in as a bulk delivery, that's a pretty safe product. So you don't have to worry about it. But as you start to get into some of these advanced techniques, those can be you got to know your chemicals. If it is in a liquid, it's amber in color when it's either under pressure or when it's cooled down a lot. Obviously, if anybody's worked with chlorine gas, I've been around it a bunch. I'm hazmat certified, suited up and gone in and all that kind of fun stuff. It's not something you want to get a face full of. Anybody been around chlorine gas and got hit with it? Okay, I've been exposed enough that I don't want a big hit. It'll knock you flat in a second. And one of the big things when we were talking yesterday was about people doing changeovers. They were using 150-pound cylinders, and I asked them. I said, "Well, do you have your respirator stuff?" I said, "Well, we have them." Okay, that doesn't mean you're wearing them. That means you have them. Well, it doesn't do you any good if it's hanging on the wall, sitting in a closet, sitting in your locker. When you're in there, it's not to go in and do repairs, but it's an escape mechanism. And it's important when you're working around chlorine gas that you have the right respirators on, that the cartridges are actually good, they're not expired, and that you can get out of there if you have a problem. That's real important. And then who's going to come in and do the repairs for you? Who's going to come in and stop a leak? Or you got your local fire department. Most of the small volunteers don't have the training, don't have the equipment. So who's going to come in and do that for you? That's a big consideration. So we either have cylinders or containers, or we also have rail cars. Rail cars are huge. City of Dallas uses a lot of it. I think they were talking about Chattanooga still uses rail cars. They're looking at moving away because it's in populated areas. And if you have a leak or something like that, huge amount. We had a
systems are looking to move away from it.
Yeah.
Some of them are in the process.
Yeah. Well, and it doesn't matter if we would have anywhere from 15 to 30 ton containers in our storage area. I mean, it doesn't matter if you have a rail car sitting outside, or the only thing is I'd have to have catastrophic failure and a bunch of them to have the same volume if I had one catastrophic failure in that rail car. But we actually had a leak, had a derailment of a train outside of San Antonio, not very far, maybe 15 years ago. But it punctured the rail car full of chlorine gas. And so you had local farmers and stuff right in the area call in, and they told them shelter in place. The people that sheltered in place died. The people that decided that they were not taking that advice and jumped in their vehicle despite being in the clouds of chlorine gas and four-wheel drive out across fields running through barbed wire and all, they survived. They still had impact, but they survived. They got out of there. And they found out a lot of the things that they weren't doing right. You got small local volunteer fire departments that really know the area, but then you have the big city coming in, overriding them. They were trying to walk into where the leak was. By the time they got there, they were out of air. So now you got to rescue people that are trying to respond. You know, so it was a real big write-up on what not to do in many, many ways. So whenever you're dealing with it, chlorine is exceptionally effective, but there's also a lot of danger with it. So
Curious, you said it was so far away that you run out of gas before you got in. How did they eventually get in?
they actually, what they did, there was a couple of things that they did. First of all, they used the little like gators or whatever to drive in. So they drove in on a little utility vehicles.
Not needing oxygen to run.
Well, the thing is they were able, it was out open enough and there was enough dispersal that they were able to get up next to it or close enough to it. And then what they did is they took pieces of wood, 2x4 and stuff like that, and they pounded it into the gash on the side of the rail car. And as they got enough of that material in there, it started to freeze up around it because it's endothermic. It's pulling all the energy out of the atmosphere. That's why you can freeze up your containers or your cylinders. They were able to pound enough stuff up in there that it froze around it to stop the leak. But by the time they did it, I mean, you can think about how much had already been lost out of the rail car, too. I don't remember if it was how many rail cars they had that were punctured, but. What was that, Jerry?
I can't imagine that much chlorine, because I had a small leak at Cold Springs one time on the lead work, and the way I found it that morning, the doorknob came off in my hand, and I had the doorknob. I can't imagine how much chlorine
Yep.
that was in.
Yep. Well, and if you think about it, chlorine expands. If you have a cup of chlorine, of chlorine liquid, it'll expand 460 times as it goes into gas. So you can imagine how many, how many hundreds of gallons are in that rail car. And they actually had photos, aerial photos afterwards of how much was dead, all the vegetation. I mean, it was a huge, and you could tell which way the wind pattern was because it was more in one area. Their 911 system didn't work nearly as well as they had hoped for notification. And luckily it was out in a sparsely populated area. If it had been in the middle of town or something like that, that would have been a huge situation. So, in fact, in San Antonio, they have a historic pumping station right there on the Riverwalk, which is a big tourist attraction in San Antonio. Well, it sits down below most of the other street levels, so it's a low-lying area. Chlorine gas is heavier than air, so it's going to settle into your low areas. And they had ton containers there. So they went over, they recognized that was a real potential hazard in that area. A lot of tourists, low-lying area, lots of chlorine gas, not a great combination. So they went to the on-site generation. Now, we have a real hard water, so they're having a lot of problems because you got to soften the water before you can go into your electrolysis, but that was a decision that they made. And supposedly Chattanooga, they were talking about getting away from the big rail cars because of some of that same potential. But it's very effective if you start looking at math. I know Anna was talking about earlier about no math, but if you start looking at math, look at how much more you're going to have to use of a bleach or something like that versus 100% chlorine and using 6%. So it's not practical for a big system that's pushing, 30, 40, 50 million gallons a day. It's not practical to use a liquid bleach. It's just not. So.
If you generate on the side, your salt, it's still not
Yes. Yeah, and there's
100, 200, 300, 400 million gallons a day.
Yes, sir. Yeah, so if you start calculating out how much you're going to need, depending on the demand that's in the source water and all. So those are all considerations. When we start looking at chlorine, how much can we actually pull? If we're under vacuum, we can get about 1 pound per day per degree Fahrenheit. Off of a container, we can get about 8. If we're just letting it free flow off of the tank pressure, we can get about 42 pounds off of the cylinder, and the container we can get almost 340. And of course, the higher the temperature, the better it is. So we do need to keep our chlorinator rooms up at a certain temperature. Texas, we don't have a whole lot of problems, especially down south. We can pull some gas like crazy. But when you're up north, you got to have, if you are using 150s or something like that, you do need to have a heated room. Okay, you're not going to get any out on cold days. If you are doing a hypochlorination, if you have the powder and you're making a solution with it, you're going to have a mix and take. You're going to pull off the supernatant off the top, and then you're just going to meter it out into your system. And then, of course, there's going to be some fluctuation in your strength, so that's going to be how you're going to have to adjust off your residuals. You're going to look at your residuals and change your metering appropriately. And then, of course, most small systems are going to use either hyperchlorination or you're going to use your bleach solutions. Look real quick at gas chlorination. Nobody's using it here. So it's going to go through an inlet. We're going to have water flowing through, and it's going to pull a vacuum. How do we tell how much we're sending each day? We need to have a rotometer, and then it's going to be mixed into the water. So here's a diagram of it. On the real big systems, they actually pull off the liquid, and then they run it through evaporators. That was our wastewater treatment facility. Our large one was pushing about 100 million a day, but wastewater has high demand on it. So they were using a lot of it. And then not only do you have to chlorinate, but at wastewater facilities, you have to dechlorinate before you send it out to the receiving streams. We talked a little bit about our demand and our residuals. The dosage is how much we're putting in. Demand is how much is being used up. And then we need to have a residual left over. And I like to think about it as our paycheck. Dosage is what we're getting paid. The demand is how much is going out to the mortgage company and the ex-wife or whoever else. And then hopefully we have a little bit left over at the end. So we've got to meet that demand in order to have that residual. And so that's, normally we don't measure our demand. It's just the difference between what we're feeding and what we have left over. Looking at our residuals, everybody here is using free. In Texas, they're doing a lot of the chloramine, so they're using a combined residual, so you need a different powder pillow for it. And then you look at, on the wastewater side, most of the time you're looking at your total residual chlorine, which is your free and your combined added together. Minimum requirements, got to have a 0.2, preferably a little bit higher than that. Give yourself a little bit of wiggle room in case you have a problem. Can't have higher than a 4 on your running average. And then we need to test it on a daily basis. Are y'all testing every day? Okay. What are we using for measuring device? We've already talked about preferred DPD or an approved DPA method. That's preferred. And then calibrations and all are very important. What are we doing when we're actually putting chlorine into water? Well, water is disassociating into hydrogen ions and hydroxide ions. And so when the chlorine is binding with those, we're making a hypochlorous acid, which is our real disinfectant. That's the effective part of it. And then we're making a hydrochloric acid. And that's the problem that's going to be with us too. If we're exposed to it, we have moisture in our lungs and our nasal passages, our eyes. We're making hydrochloric acid in our bodies and on our bodies. So that's something you really got to think about when you're trying to protect yourself. What kind of PPE do you need? What's really the disinfecting power? What are we going to be able to reduce or destroy as far as the pathogens? When you're looking at chlorine, this is, as we're starting to add chlorine, it's all being used up. And then we get into our phase 2, and we're actually starting to get a residual. And that's where we would want to be. We'd want to be on the high side of 2, but not into 3 if we were using our combined, like chloramines or something like that. And then you get into phase 3, and we actually have a decrease. And so when you start to have a lot of taste and odor issues, people say, man, it really tastes like chlorine, like a swimming pool and all, you're probably in your area of number 3. And the way you tell that is boost up your chlorine a little bit, boost it up a little bit, and your residual's going to drop. Because most people, when they start getting calls, hey, it tastes really bad, tastes like swimming pool, they're like, well, we need to back off, we're feeding too much. No, you got to feed more. Because once you hit break point, now you're not going to have those taste and odor issues unless you're like really, really high. So once you hit break point, now as you increase your feed rate, you're going to increase your residual also. So a lot of times when people get in trouble is they're in that phase of 3 up in here, and they start backing off. Well, now they're going to have even more taste and odor issues. Okay. Yeah, if it's counterintuitive, if you add less and you have a higher residual, you're not in the right area. You need to keep going. So that's a real important component of disinfection. And when you get into your B and A level licensing in the state of Texas, you have to be able to draw it, name all your areas, and at A level, you actually have to do an essay on breakpoint chlorination. It's really important. It's an important concept, and when you start looking at combined, then you really have to pay attention because you're going to have to be right up at this, real close to that phase change, and so there's a lot of adjustments and calculations to do on that. Talking about safety, we need to keep our equipment segregated, keep our chemicals and stuff segregated properly. When you're feeding, when you look at your feeding capacity, you're supposed to have 50% greater capacity than your highest demand at your peak flow. And that's the way we need to gauge our equipment. You want it above ground, especially if you're using gas. Want it above ground because it's going to settle, so don't have it down in a basement or a little sump area. Got to keep things separated. Got to have proper ventilation. Even if you're using bleach and all, it's good to make sure whatever area you're feeding in, that it's well ventilated. And with gas especially, you want to force air in from the top and then let it escape out the bottom because it's going to push the chlorine gas out. Normally, if you're going to have, especially with chlorine gas, you're going to have it separated. Got to keep it up at temperature properly. Need to know how much we're using, so the state requires us to have a scale. And of course, that's going to help us with our process. It's going to help us with our ability to gauge how much we're using. If we have a big change in our daily use, we need to go back and investigate and see what's happening with it. Homeland security is a big issue, so we need to keep our equipment locked, secured. And then if you are using the bleach or something, keep it covered. You don't want it exposed to the sun. You don't want critters getting in it and stuff like that. Nobody here is having to do any risk management. Where if you have more than a certain amount of chemical on site, more than 2,500 pounds, you've got to go into a RMP program. A lot of paperwork, a lot of hassles. So luckily, y'all don't have to deal with that. You should have evacuation procedures, even if you just have. Even on a simple bleach solution, if somebody gets sprayed with it, if it's under pressure or something, what are you going to do? Do you have a little eye wash station? If you have a spill, how are you going to respond to it? Okay. Especially if you're using gas and all, you've got to really look at more stuff. If you are on gas, then you're going to, Jared mentioned earlier about with you, how are you going to detect it besides your door handle falling off? You're going to go in there and you're going to use ammonium hydroxide. You're going to see your whiffs of smoke. You're going to be able to kind of pinpoint your area and go in there and do a repair. If you're properly trained and you have the proper equipment. Not good to walk in there and find out you got a leaking roof. That's not the way to find out. Handheld detectors, the best is to have actually wall mounted and have sensors on the inside. We had an issue when they gone through the construction of our facility. They had vents for our vacuum regulators. Well, they vented them right out to the front of the building. That's where our meter was. So you go up there to see if you have a leak, and it's venting right there in your face. So needless to say, we relined them, replumbed them out to the back, and put them in a vault with a sensor. So if you did have a leak, it's contained in a small underground vault, and it lets us know through SCADA. When in doubt, contact the discipliner. I don't know if anybody's actually doing any chlorine response stuff. Y'all don't have gas, but you got to be well trained. You got to have the right equipment, and got to have backup teams. If you do get hit by it, you need to get them outside. Definitely try to wash them off, even with the bleach and all. But with gas, it'll impregnate your clothes. It'll continue to off gas, so you're breathing that over an extended period of time. So you got to get out of those clothes. Got to wash out properly. Flush your face. Eye wash stations, even on a little bleach solution, it's easy to have it if you have a sink available. You can get a little eye wash station that attaches to your faucet. That's real good safety practice. And if you do get a heavy hit of gas, milk is the best thing for it. It'll help neutralize it and coat your throat. Okay. If you're really bad, you're gonna need more help. Talk real quick about alternative disinfectants. Chlorine dioxide, ozone, and UV. I don't think anybody's using chlorine dioxide around. It is real effective, but the big problem is that it produces byproducts out in your system. So there's real tight regulations on what are you sending out, like 0.8 A 0.8, you better start worrying. If you hit a 1, you got a lot of problems. 1 milligram per liter, because they are producing byproducts that are real harmful. So a lot of people are using it as a pre-treatment and then sending out regular chlorine, free chlorine residual. Does cost more. It's on-site generation, stuff like that. Ozone is great, wonderful, really, really powerful, really, really expensive. No residual, so you can't use it as your final disinfectant. And then you can produce aldehydes as a byproduct. So, like I say, one of the things with ozone is if you are using it in your system, you have to have it has to be under vacuum, and you have to have a recovery, because you can't just let it vent to atmosphere. Because the ozone issues, we talked about the CFCs years ago, the holes in the ozone hole, you can't capture them. So you've got to have a process to capture it and then reduce it in order to let it escape. UV, and I don't know if anybody uses UV in the area.
Small
A lot in the Virgin Islands. Everybody was using UV, and they'd see the little blue light or purple light in there, and it gave them a warm, fuzzy feeling. And everything's great and wonderful. It is beneficial for certain aspects. Wastewater treatment is looking at a lot of that on the UV, because then you don't have to dechlorinate. The problem is if you have turbidity issues, that really minimizes the effectiveness of it. There's a lot of preventative maintenance and upkeep on it. You got to go in there and use acids to clean your quartz and stuff. It's a chore. And then you got to look at your lamp hours. Expensive, a lot of energy costs. We were talking about this yesterday. Somebody put in UV, and once they started getting the energy bills, they said, "I don't think we're going to use UV." So that's something to really consider before you change your practices. You don't get any disinfection byproducts because there's no chemical reaction. It's just what's happening in your skin. If you're out in the sun too much, you're mutating your DNA, and that's what it's doing to the microorganisms. It doesn't produce a residual, so you can't use it as final disinfectant in your distribution system. That is disinfection. Questions, comments?